All right, in this video, we're going to take a look at ways to represent data. So make sure you put today's date in the top left-hand corner or right-hand corner of your notes, whatever is easier for you. So when we think of data, data is normally just a list of numbers that come from some data that you collected or some information that you collected from something. So for example, in school, a lot of times you'll see data of student scores. So let's say I had a quiz and these are the scores that certain students had on their quiz. So let's say we had Amy, who scored an 85, Greg, who scored a 90, Dominique, who scored a 95, Cam, who scored a 100, and Farah, who scored a 90. So right now I just have a list of some students with their scores. So one way that you can already represent the data would just be in a table. And this is pretty much in a table as it is right now. It would help if we kind of put some titles to the information. So the first thing you want to do is create some columns. And then we label the column. So the left-hand column is the name of the student, and the right-hand column is their score. So this would just be a table of the information. So you could list the name and then the score of the person. So that's one way of representing data is through a table. Another way would be to do a bar graph. So this should be a familiar way that you've seen data represented. So when you have a bar graph, you normally have two axes, the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. And generally you have them labeled. So on this column, or this side, we have the score, and on the bottom we have the name of the student. And then generally you want to go up by a consistent number. So here I'm just going to count by 20s. So 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. And then I can put a line for halfway through so I know where the odd numbers are. So 10, 30, 50, 70, 90, so on. So now we can write down the students' names and then create a bar graph of their scores. So we have Amy, Greg, Dominique, Cam, and Farah. So to represent this using a bar graph, we're just going to look at the scores. So remember from above that Amy scored an 85. So I'm going to make a bar graph over Amy's name. So it's just a bar. 85 is in between 80 and 90. So there's Amy's bar. Greg scored a 90. So I'm going to go up to 90. Dominique scored a 95, so I'm going to go up to 95. Cam scored a 100, So I'll go up to 100. And Farah scored a 90, so I'll go up to 90. The last thing you want to do is name the title of your bar graph. So we have student scores. So here we have a bar graph, which is another way to represent data. So we looked at a table, then we looked at a bar graph. Another way would be through a dot plot. So I'm showing you different ways. We're going to study each of them individually and see what's the benefit of using one versus another. But this is just the ways that we represent data and then how we interpret the data from our representation of it. So the last example you'll see that we'll talk about is probably a new one, or one you're not as familiar with, and that's going to be a dot plot. So remember, the frequency or the number of our scores was 85, 90, 95, 100, and 90 again. So here I'm going to use the bottom, the horizontal axis, and I'm going to count by fives, since this will represent all of my data. So I have 85, 90, 95, 100. These are the scores that student had. And on the side, we're going to have the frequency of that number. So how often do you see that number occurring? So once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and you can keep counting higher and higher. All right, so for 85, there's 185, so I'm going to put a big dot over 85 to show that that's one of the numbers. There's a 90, so I'm going to put a dot over 90. There's a 95. There's a 100. And then there's a 90 again. So a dot plot just shows you the frequency of a number and how often it occurs. So when I'm looking at this dot plot, I can see that 5 students have scores because there's 5 dots, and the most number of students was over 90. So this is a different way of representing data. This is called a dot plot. So over the course of this unit, we're going to look at some ways to represent data and how we interpret the data that's represented. We're going to start with the dot plots and frequency tables in the next video. But first, let's get some practice as representing data in different ways. So let's try practice number 1.